It was my first day working for this plumbing company. I was called in for my first job to this house out of town. The plumbing company had 5 employees, and the owner would choose who does what job. I don't see it as a coincidence that I was sent to some undesirable job far away in a shitty area for my first job. The call was for a leaky pipe under the sink, which is typically the easiest, most basic job to get a call for, depending on the root cause of it. I pulled up to the house, my first ever call, and it was an absolutely disgusting looking house, completely run down as if no one had lived there for years. I went up to the house and knocked until a middle-aged man opened the door. I didn't like his aura from the start. He had this unflattering, disproportionately wide smile that made his entire face appear off-putting. His voice was also really soft and high-pitched, not the voice I was expecting to come out of his mouth. Or maybe it was, given his unusual appearance. He welcomed me inside of the house. I realized there wasn't a single piece of furniture in the house. "Just moved in?" I asked. He replied, "Yes," and then chuckled, or maybe I should say he giggled because it was just a weird high-pitched little laugh. He brought me to the kitchen, and the first thing I did was set my stuff down on the counter, then open the cabinets under the sink. I slid myself under the sink and started to examine the pipe, specifically looking at the P-trap and the lock nuts to make sure they weren't overly tight or loose. I noticed the man was standing directly over me, his legs spread wide so that I was sandwiched between both of his feet. It was extremely uncomfortable. I asked him politely to give me some space, and he backed up a bit, but not enough that would make me feel comfortable. I realized that I didn't see any water leaking at all, so I got out from under the sink and tried running the water, but no water came out of the faucet. I looked at the weird man and asked him why the water wasn't running. He said he must have shut off the main water valve without realizing it. When I say I stood there speechless for a few seconds, I'm not exaggerating. I asked him bluntly, "How do you do something like that by mistake?" He smiled and shrugged his shoulders. I asked him to turn the water valve back on. He turned and said he'd be right back, and I saw him leave the kitchen. But then I heard footsteps walking upstairs. I'd never in my life heard of a water valve being upstairs in any house. I knew something was off with this guy and the situation. Everything from the condition of this house to his mannerisms. Then I started hearing multiple sets of footsteps from upstairs coming down the steps quickly. In a split second, I decided I was out of there. I grabbed my stuff and quickly walked out to the front door and my van. I'm a pretty large and loud dude, so I'm not really intimidated very easily by people in a physical way. But there was something about that situation and that guy that told me that something was about to go down. I looked at the house for a second and then I drove away. I called Elmer, my boss, letting him know it was just some kind of prank because that just sounded better than me saying I was scared of that guy. I did a few minutes worth of investigating and found out that that was just a vacant abandoned house. I got the number that made the call for the alleged leaky pipe from Elmer, and it turned out to be a voice-over IP number, not even a real number. I reported this shady encounter to the local police department just so that they would be aware of it and maybe close off that house. I've never had a reason to return to that sketchy part of town again. I only worked for that specific plumbing company for about a year. The Irene's residence loomed large and old at the end of a gravel driveway, the late summer sun casting long, eerie shadows over its peeling white paint. I'd been babysitting for a few years now, but this was my first time with the Irene kids, Galvin, 9-year-old, and Vivian, 5-year-old. Mrs. Irene had left in a hurry, promising she'd be back by midnight. I waved her off and turned to face the 2 children, their faces blank with curiosity. The evening started innocently enough. I fixed the kids some macaroni and cheese, and we watched cartoons together. Galvin seemed shy but well-mannered, and Vivian, though quiet, had a sweet smile that made me feel at ease. It was around 9 p.m. when I tucked them into bed, reading them a story until they drifted off. As I descended the creaky stairs, I settled on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. The house was old and creaky, every sound amplified in the silence. I shrugged off the eerie feeling that seemed to settle over the room. That's when my phone rang. I frowned. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered, "Hello." There was a long pause filled only with static. I was about to hang up when a voice, distorted and barely audible, whispered, "Have you checked on the children?" A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the baby monitor on the coffee table, the screen showing Galvin and Vivian sound asleep. My logical mind told me it was just a prank call, but something in the voice felt wrong. I hung up and tried to shake off the unease. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID was blank. I picked it up with trembling hands. "Who is this?" I asked. The same static-filled silence, followed by the same whisper, more insistent now, "Check on the children." My heart pounded as I crept upstairs, peeking into the children's room. They were still asleep, undisturbed. I exhaled, feeling relieved, and returned to the living room, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. The third call came almost immediately after I sat down. The voice was different now, more menacing. "If you don't check on the children, something bad will happen." Fear surged through me, and I bolted upstairs, flinging the door open. The room was as I had left it, but Galvin's bed was empty. Panic welled up as I scanned the room, finding him standing in the corner, his back to me. "Galvin," I whispered, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, my heart racing. Just as I reached out to touch him, his head snapped around, eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth moved without making a sound. The baby monitor crackled to life, and I could hear a low, guttural whisper repeating, "Check on the children." I grabbed Galvin, pulling him back to bed and tucking him in tightly, my hands shaking as I did. I heard soft, creaky footsteps behind me. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. Desperate to break the tension, I picked up the baby monitor, thinking it might be malfunctioning. The screen flickered, showing static before focusing back on the children. This time, there was a shadowy figure standing at the foot of Vivian's bed, its form indistinct but looming. I blinked, and it was gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I called Mrs. Irene, hoping for some reassurance. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I was about to hang up when a voice came through. But it wasn't Mrs. Irene. It was the same distorted whisper from the calls, "They're not your children." Terrified, I ran back to the children's room, nearly tripping on the stairs in my haste. I found them both awake, sitting up in bed, staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "The man," Vivian whispered, "the man with no face. He's watching us." A shiver ran down my spine. I looked around the room, but it was just us. "There's no one here, sweetie. You're safe." But as I turned off the light, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, something tall and dark standing in the doorway. I slammed the door shut, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was this faceless man? The phone rang again, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, I answered. "Leave the house," the voice hissed. "Leave now, or you will never leave at all." I grabbed the children, my heart pounding in my chest. We ran downstairs, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Just as we reached the front door, it swung open, revealing Mrs. Irene standing there, her eyes wide with shock. "What's going on?" she demanded. I don't know," I stammered. There were calls and a man. "The children," she looked past me, her face paling. "The children." I turned, blood running cold. Galvin and Vivian were gone. My first day as a plumber started like any other. A call came in from an older woman in a creaky old house on the edge of town, reporting severe leaks in her kitchen. I was eager to make a good impression and maybe score a repeat customer. I had no idea what I was in for. When I arrived, the house was shrouded in an unsettling stillness. The lady, Mrs. Beatrix, was a frail, wary woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. She led me back in 2004. I was a broke teenager, so my mom made me get a job at our local McDonald's. It was nothing special. It was my very first day working at McDonald's. I was so nervous but excited to start my new job. I got the breakfast shift and had to be there to start prepping at 5 a.m. I hardly slept the night before, anxious about making a good impression. I arrived early, introduced myself to the manager, Callista, and she got me set up. I spent the first hour or so watching training videos and filling out paperwork. Callista said I was picking things up quickly and could start helping out up front. Around 7:30 a.m., things started to pick up as we got into the core breakfast rush. I was working the register, taking orders and collecting payments. We had a full restaurant, people eating, people waiting in line. I recognized a few regulars Callista pointed out. About a half hour into my register duty, the front door chimed as a customer walked in. He was a white man, probably early 40s, average height and build, wearing jeans, boots, and a plain black windbreaker. He quietly got into line, keeping his head down. When he got to me, he ordered a sausage McMuffin meal to go and handed me a $10 bill. As I opened the cash drawer to make change, he suddenly pulled out a gun from his coat pocket. I froze in terror and shock. This couldn't be happening, I thought. The man shouted violently for everyone to get down and shut up or he would start shooting. A woman nearby let out a scream, which agitated the man. In a flash, he rapidly fired the gun at her, and the bullet hit her directly in the chest. She collapsed to the floor, the whole scene unfolding in mere seconds. The robber grabbed me by the shirt over the counter and put the hot barrel firmly into my cheek. His eyes were bulging and frenetic, like he was on heavy drugs. He told me to empty the cash register drawer immediately into a bag he threw at me. My hands were quivering so badly I could hardly grasp the money. Meanwhile, the rest of the lobby had erupted into pandemonium, with some people running for the door and others ducking behind tables. Just then, the manager, Callista, came rushing out from the back area. She saw the woman bleeding out on the tiled floor, then the robber pressing the gun to my face. I could see Callista assessing the situation, hesitating for a moment on what to do next. In that pause, the crazed robber suddenly withdrew from me and fired 2 consecutive shots directly at Callista. A piercing temporary deafness filled my ears. Callista's body hit the floor with a sick thud. I looked at the gory wound in her chest in utter disbelief, expecting she might gasp for air or show any splinter of life, but she was already gone. An eerie silence fell over the restaurant. The reality and trauma finally set in for me. I became lightheaded and could feel myself nearly passing out. Through the fog, I could hear police sirens approaching outside. The robber grabbed the bag of cash from the counter where I had dropped it. On his way out, he fired the gun erratically behind him towards anyone standing nearby. I later learned one of those final bullets killed a man who had been waiting quietly for his breakfast order when the madness broke out. The survivor guilt crushed me for weeks, thinking if I had gotten the robber what he wanted faster, that man might be alive. But the trauma counselors told me that was misplaced blame. In the end, 3 people were dead, and I was left emotionally scarred from the events of my first day. The robber was caught the next day trying to skip town. Every time I pass a McDonald's now, everything comes flooding back as if it just happened yesterday. Into the kitchen where water was steadily pooling under the sink, spreading out across the faded linoleum. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said in a voice that quivered like dry leaves. "It's been like this for days. I've had trouble getting someone out here." I nodded and got to work, sliding under the sink with my flashlight in hand. The smell hit me first, something foul and putrid, far worse than just mold or mildew. The pipes were ancient, corroded, and clearly the source of the leak. As I began to dismantle them, a thick, dark sludge oozed out, filling the air with a nauseating stench. "Looks like you've got some serious blockage here, Mrs. Beatrix," I called out, trying to keep the disgust out of my voice. She didn't respond. When I glanced over my shoulder, she was standing in the doorway, watching me with those unnervingly sharp eyes. I turned back to the pipes, focusing on clearing the obstruction. As I pulled out handfuls of the thick muck, I noticed something odd. Among the sludge were small bones, animal bones, I thought at first, but then I saw what looked like tiny, human-like fingers, complete with nails. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept working, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a rat had gotten stuck in the pipes and decomposed, but the fingers, they were too perfect, too intact. As I probed deeper, my flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. The silence was oppressive, and the smell seemed to grow stronger, almost as if it were pressing down on me. "Mrs. Beatrix," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the confined space. "Do you have another flashlight?" No response. I scrambled out from under the sink, my hands covered in the vile sludge, and found the kitchen empty. Mrs. Beatrix was gone. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak light to navigate the dim room. That's when I saw it, a small wooden door in the corner of the kitchen, slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. Curiosity and dread battled within me, but the plumber in me needed to know where the pipes led. I pushed open the door and descended the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing ominously. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with the same overpowering stench. My phone's light swept across the room, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. There were jars, dozens of them, lined up on shelves, filled with murky liquid and what looked like more of those tiny bones. In the center of the room was an old, rusted tub connected to the pipes that ran up into the kitchen. Inside the tub was the source of the blockage, a grotesque, half-decomposed figure, its limbs twisted unnaturally and its face frozen in a grimace of pain. The fingers, they matched the ones I'd found in the pipes. Panic gripped me, and I stumbled back, knocking over one of the jars. It shattered, spilling its foul contents across the floor. I turned to flee, but there, at the top of the stairs, stood Mrs. Beatrix. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, and a twisted smile played on her lips. "You weren't supposed to see this," she said softly, almost kindly. "But now that you have." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I bolted past her, adrenaline fueling my sprint through the house and out the door. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my van, my heart pounding and my mind racing. I reported what I'd seen to the authorities, but when they arrived, the house was empty. The jar, the body in the tub, everything was gone. Mrs. Beatrix had vanished without a trace. That was my first and last day as a plumber. The memory of those tiny fingers in the pipe still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that Mrs. Beatrix is still out there, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble into her web. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.